안녕하세요. LA중앙일보 원영석 기자입니다. 오늘은 미국에서 가장 유명한 라디오 진행자 중에 한 분인 레리 엘더를 모시고 깊은 정치 얘기를 나눠보도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 레리 엘더 진행자께 자기소개를 좀 간단하게 할 수 있는 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. Larry, can you kind of introduce yourself to our
Sure.
viewers?
My name is Larry Elder. I am a nationally syndicated talk radio host. I'm in about 300 markets. I've been doing radio since 1994. I also do a lot of television, had a couple of nationally syndicated TV shows, and I'm a regular, I guess you could call it regular contributor to Fox News and to CNN International and a bunch of other webcast cable outlets.
네, 그 흑인 출신 변호사고요. 레리 엘더는요. 그리고 미국의 유력 신문에 고정 칼럼을 연재하고 있고 현재 라디오 방송국 KRLA 870 AM. From what time to what time?
I'm on KRLA from 6p until 9p.
예, 오후 6시부터 오후 9시까지 들으실 수가 있습니다. 예, 엘더가 진행하는 시사 토크쇼는요. 미국 사회 현안 문제를 청취자와 함께 토론하는 프로그램인데 남가주 일대에서는 청취율 1위입니다. 그래서 흑인이면서 인종 문제를 비롯한 각종 현안에 언제나 중립적인 입장을 해서 그 입바른 소리를 하기 때문에 흑인 단체로부터도 비난을 받는데요. 오늘 미국 대선 전체적인 얘기들을 좀 나눠보고요. 그다음에 도널드 트럼프 대통령 당선인 그리고 버락 오바마 대통령 이제 8년 임기를 마쳤는데 그 부분에 대한 평가 그리고 한인과 흑인 사회 간의 관계 등에 대해서 얘기를 나눠보도록 하겠습니다. Let's start by talking talk radio. So how did you get into talk radio business?
Michael, a really bizarre story. I was living in Cleveland, Ohio, and every now and then I would get a column published. I didn't have a deal. I would just write a column and just send it in. And usually they were rejected, but every now and then one would get published. So I wrote one talking about how taxes were too high, regulation was too intrusive, and the government was too big. And I had one or two sentences in there about racism. This is 25 years ago, and I said racism is no longer a major problem in America. I get a phone call from a producer of a radio show. He didn't care what I said about taxes, didn't care what I said about regulation, didn't care what I said about the government, but he was astounded that a black person felt that racism wasn't a major problem in America. And he produced this guy's radio show and asked me to come on as a guest. I was on for an hour, and I was called an Uncle Tom and a bootlicking Uncle Tom and a foot-shuffling bootlicking Uncle Tom, and a coon, and an Oreo, and a coconut. I was called the Antichrist, and one guy said something that really is designed to make a black person's feelings hurt. He called me a Republican. And I was on for an hour, and it was just yelling and screaming. I thought, a complete stupid waste of time. I get back to my office, and the guy's boss called me. And he said, I heard you. And he said, I thought you were so incredibly funny, and you have a good speaking voice, and you took difficult positions, and you didn't get flustered when you defended them. Have you ever thought about doing talk radio? And I said, no. And he said, I have a guy going on vacation next week. I want you to sit in for him. I said, no. He said, why? I said, I don't like it. He said, why? I said, I don't like being yelled at. I don't like yelling back at other people. It just seems kind of silly. No, thank you. He said, are you married? At the time, I was married. And he said, go home to your wife and talk this over, and I think maybe you'll change your mind. I said, I'll do that, but I doubt that I'll change my mind. So I went home to my then wife, Cindy, and I told her about this. She said, what do you think about talk radio? I said, I don't know anything about it other than it seems shallow, glib, and stupid. She said, it is. You'd be good at it. And so I said, really? Because yeah. So I sat in for the guy for a week, and I loved it. I was able to get all the things off my chest that bothered me, and it was like I heard angels singing. The skies opened up. And so I said, this is what I want to do. So it took me about 2 years to meet people and write letters and persist. And I finally met Dennis Prager, who's on my same station right now. And Dennis had me on as a guest. And the station manager heard me. Same thing happened. He called me and asked me if I ever thought about doing talk radio. This is 2 years after the first experience. And so he gave me a 2-day audition. After the first day, he made me an offer. And I was at KABC Radio for almost 22 years.
Oh, wow, amazing. So did you listen to Rush Limbaugh or any of these superstar talk?
I really hadn't. I knew who Rush Limbaugh was, and I'd heard him before, and I knew who Howard Stern was, and I heard him before. But that's about it. I never listened to radio on any kind of consistent basis because I lived downtown in Cleveland, so I walked.
Okay.
And radio.
Oh, so you didn't listen to the car?
No, radio often is a car experience.
Yes.
So I never did that, and so I had no idea what I was doing when I got hired by KABC. I didn't know how to take a phone call. I didn't know how to structure a show because I never listened before. And I listened for about 2 weeks before I started trying to get an idea of what the format was.
So you were pretty much really a newbie. at that time?
Complete newbie. And I found out later on that when I got hired over the objection of management in New York because they wanted somebody with experience. And my sole experience had been that 1 week I'd sat in 2 weeks earlier. And so that's all I knew about talk radio. Next thing you know, I'm doing a regular nighttime show for 3 hours a day in LA, which is arguably the biggest talk radio market, certainly in the country.
Right, yeah. And didn't you also appear on TV shows? Because I remember seeing you on TV. When did you get to
Well,
work on TV?
actually, I started TV before radio. When I was
okay.
living in Cleveland, I had a radio show on PBS, and then I had another one on the Fox affiliate. And so, frankly, my TV experience precedes my radio experience. I started in TV in the mid '80s. Radio wasn't until till the early '90s. So, and then when I got back out here in radio, got a good agent, and I got a couple of national syndicated TV shows. One was a court show called Moral Court, which is a great show. They shouldn't have pulled the plug so quickly. And the other one was called The Larry Elder Show, and it was kind of like Oprah. And it lasted for about a year, and I wasn't that good at that. But I've done a whole lot of punditry on Fox and on MSNBC and on CNN.
Yeah. So who resembles your view the most among all the talk show radio hosts out there? Do you think is it Rush or Sean Hannity or any other? I think you are a unique.
Well, I'm a libertarian. Yeah. Those guys are not libertarians. I believe the government should be as small as possible, and that government shouldn't be involved in issues like drugs or abortion or gay marriage. These are things that should be done at the local level, and I think they differ from that. But there's a lot of overlap.
Do you think talk radio would be a stronger force as time goes by, or is it going to be pretty much how it is now, in your opinion?
Wow. I don't think it's going to go away. I think talk radio has a very, very important role.
Yeah.
Where else can you get like an unvarnished opinion, and also long-form opinion? The problem with television is it's so staccato. You have very short interviews, and you really can't get into developing an issue. On talk radio, you can spend 3 hours talking about the same thing if you want. Especially conservative talk radio, of the top 20 sources where people get their news, whether it's CNN or New York Times or LA Times, of the top 20 sources, 18 of them are to the left. Only 2 are to the right, and that's Washington Times and the Fox News with Brett Baer. Outside of that, if you are conservative, even if you're not conservative and you want to hear a conservative or a non-liberal point of view, talk radio is probably the best way to get it.
Why do you think the conservative, talk radio has succeeded, beyond our wildest dream? But like Air America, these progressive radios doesn't work. Is it because
I call it Airhead America? Well, I'll tell you why. In my opinion, it's because it's an echo chamber. If you're on left-wing radio, all you need to do is turn on CNN. All you need to do is turn on MSNBC. All you need to do is read the New York Times or the LA Times or the Chicago Tribune, and you will know what a left-wing point of view is. But in order for you to find out there's a different way of looking at climate change, there's a different way of looking at taxes, a different way of looking at education, how it should be funded, you're going to have to go to an alternative source for that, and you can uniquely go to conservative talk radio and get that. But the regular views, taxes are, rich people don't pay enough, there's a gap between the rich and the poor, we need to do something about income inequality, climate change is a fact. You're going to get that from any of those other sources.
So let's talk about the media since we're at it. What should we do about it? Like New York Times, Washington Post, and LA Times, CNN, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, NBC. They all tilt to the left. Everybody's
right.
That even the former UCLA professor, Tim Grossclose. I don't know whether you know him. He wrote.
Yeah, he's a very good friend of mine.
Yeah, I did an interview with him too, and he also said, it's just completely to the left. And there's probably Fox News, like you said, in Washington Times, probably Wall Street Journal.
Actually, not even the Wall Street Journal. The editorial page of the Wall Street Journal is conservative, but the news section is not.
It's pretty much hard news, right? Mm-hmm. And so so they even condemn alternative media as fake news recently, right? This fake news is a new narrative. It seems like that they come out with. Do you think the media has lost the trust forever after this election cycle? What is your opinion?
I think the media lost its sense of trustworthiness a long time ago. There's a book that came out called Bias by Bernard Goldberg. That came out about 20 years ago or so.
CBS
and
reporter.
Talked about how he was at CBS for 28 years, and the head of the news, his name was Andrew Hayward at the time, he said, of course the media is to the left, and if you repeat that, I'll deny it. Well, Bernie wrote a book and said it, and the guy denied it. And even Peter Jennings, the longtime anchor for ABC News, said that we lean to the left. Andy Rooney, who used to be a commentator on 60 Minutes, even said that Dan Rather was, quote, transparently liberal, close quote, and needed to do a better job. So,
And Chris Matthews also admitted it too, right?
yeah, I think he has. But it's obvious the media are liberal. I remember after the 2008 election between John McCain and Barack Obama, the Washington Post ombudsperson, her name is Deborah Howell, wrote 2 articles. And she said, I looked at the front page coverage of our newspaper when we were covering John McCain and covering Barack Obama. And we gave more pictures of Barack Obama, more flattering pictures, more articles, more positive articles. We were unfair, and admitted it. So there's no question about that. The question is, what should we do about it? The answer is patronize alternative sources of media so that they will fill it in the pocketbook. And if they fill it in the pocketbook, they'll change. But as long as they don't fill it in the pocketbook, they won't. And by the way, as privately owned media, they have a right to be left-wing if they want to be. But just don't tell me you're fair and balanced. Don't have the slogan, all the news that's fit to print, when in fact you are not doing that. I mean, the WikiLeaks has exposed the Washington Post, New York Times, as being in bed, not just left-wing, but actively working to help get Hillary elected. I mean, my goodness. New York Times writer was covering Hillary, doing a very long story on her, and gave her veto power over quotes. You're a reporter. Can you imagine?
Asking your city editor, is it okay to print it or not? Right?
Or you're covering me. It's like asking me, Larry, here, I'm going to write something about you. If you don't like it, tell me what you don't like. I'll take it out. What? And so the New York Times gave her that power, and she did remove a quote she didn't like. The Washington Post was doing an article on John Podesta, Hillary's campaign chairman, and called him and told him that they had uncovered something that might potentially be damaging. Don't worry about it, we're going to bury it. There's a columnist named Dana Milbank for the Washington Post, and he was writing a column about the 10 most outrageous things Donald Trump said, contacted the DNC, asked him for suggestions. They gave him 10 suggestions. He used 8 of them. John Harwood was one of the debate moderators on CNBC, but he's also a New York Times reporter. And here he is asking Rush Limbaugh a difficult question during the debate. He writes a letter to John Podesta bragging about it, and offered
Donald Trump, right?
writing a letter that I wrote that I put Donald Trump on his heels with this question. Ha ha ha. What do you think about what I did? And then offered the Clinton campaign advice on how they could deal with Dr. Ben Carson, whom at the time they thought might be a threat. I mean, again, this guy is not just being left-wing. He is actively working with Hillary Clinton to get her elected. So as far as I'm concerned, they lost their credibility a long time ago. They ought to be worried.
Aren't they supposed to publicly apologize about all those behavior? If it flipped around, and if Fox News did that to Donald Trump, feed them questions in advance, before primary, wouldn't that have been a national news for a month?
I think so. And you've got Donna Brazile, who used to be with CNN, but she did get fired. CNN did fire her.
The Democratic chair.
She's the interim chair of the DNC. And here she is conspiring to make sure that Bernie Sanders doesn't win. I mean, it's absolutely flabbergasting, and there are no consequences. There's a reporter for Newsweek named Kurt Eichenwald. Kurt Eichenwald tweeted that Donald Trump had been put in a mental hospital. No evidence whatsoever, deleted the tweet, and he's still working for Newsweek.
It's just nonsense.
It's disgusting. It's outrageous.
Yeah. So I just, so this will just keep on continuing, right?
We can't stop this. I don't see how it stops as long as you have a large number of people in this country who think of conservatives not only as wrong, but as evil, bad people. And that's the way I think a lot of people think of conservatives. I think conservatives think of liberals as ill-informed. You just don't know enough. You just need the facts. But the reverse is that I believe a lot of liberals believe people like Larry Elder, people like Rush Limbaugh, people like Ted Cruz are fundamentally rotten at the core. And if you feel that way, then being biased and it's okay, yeah. Harry Reid, during the 2012 campaign, Michael, is on the floor of the Senate, and he said, the word on the street is that Mitt Romney hasn't paid any taxes.
Yeah, I know.
Let him prove it because he hasn't paid any. It was a lie. And he knew it was a lie, and later on when he was asked about it by CNN, Dana Bash of CNN asked him about it, he goes, yeah, well, I don't have any regrets. He didn't win, did he? So whatever it takes, whatever it takes. And getting back to Donna Brazile, she gave an interview to a guy named Joe Madison, who has a show on Sirius XM radio, and she said, I have no regrets about what I did, and I do it again. I mean, my goodness.
Just amazing. So do you think, recently they've been, criticized about the Russian, they you're talking about this Russian hacking. I don't think they found any additional information ever since they talked about this first time, like months ago.
Right.
And, it seems like this has been, taking is this just another narrative that the mainstream media is putting out, or do you think that there is some merit to it?
I think it's both. They still are licking their wounds from this devastating defeat, and they're blaming all sorts of people. They blamed James Comey. They blamed Julian Assange. They blamed right-wing supremacists. They're blaming everybody other than Hillary running a bad campaign and having a bad message. Do I believe, however, that the Russians were involved? I do believe they were involved. But Putin didn't write those memos. Putin didn't tell Donna Brazile to cheat. Putin didn't tell Hillary to disparage some of her supporters. Putin did not tell Hillary to put a server in her basement, did not tell her to delete 30,000 emails, including emails that were under subpoena, did not tell her to lie about it, did not tell her to lie that she had sent and received classified information, did not tell her to lie about having sent and received information that was stamped classified, which she lied about. So the reason that people felt that Hillary was not credible had nothing to do with Putin, and I believe that even if the Russians hadn't done anything, Donald Trump still would have won.
Okay, so let's talk about Donald Trump. You said among the 17 primary GOP candidates, you picked Donald Trump at 20th,
Right.
right? So why were
He was not my top guy.
Why were you so against him then? What are the key issues?
I wasn't against him. I was in favor of other people.
Yeah, but I know that you didn't like his trade deal. And,
right,
what are the reasons why you were holding back?
Well, Donald Trump is not a fiscal conservative. I'm a fiscal conservative. I'm somebody that believes government is way, way too big, and that the major entitlements program, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, never should have happened in the first place. I would have argued decades ago if I'd been around in Congress against them. But now that they're here, they need to be reformed. If you're going to be serious about the $20 trillion debt that we have, the primary driver of the debt are those major entitlements programs. If you don't talk about them and reforming them, all you're going to do is kick the can down the road. And neither Hillary nor Donald Trump talked about any of those things. So that's one thing. But the other thing is what you said about trade. Free trade helps consumers. Yes, when other trading partners...
You lose jobs, though.
When other trading partners put tariffs on us, and when CEOs move businesses out of the country and put somewhere else, people are going to lose a job. A CEO has a moral obligation, a fiduciary obligation to return shareholder equity. That's his or her job. And if I can lower my cost by putting a plant or equipment somewhere else, I have an obligation to do it. And if I don't do it, my competitors will. Now, the answer is for our educational system to be better than it is right now, so we continue to innovate, so that we continue to produce new jobs and new ways of making money. But nobody is owed a job. Just because it's unfair that my job is now being offshored somewhere else doesn't entitle me to stop my CEO from making money for my shareholders. I don't have that obligation. And when you discriminate against foreign goods by putting tariffs on it, all you're doing is punishing consumers. Milton Friedman, the economist, won a Nobel laureate, who was a big advisor to Ronald Reagan, and Donald Trump claims he's an admirer of Ronald Reagan. Milton Friedman said, by tariffs, during wartime, we blockade our enemies. During peacetime, we do to ourselves what our enemies do to us during times of war. So when you put on tariffs, what you're doing is preventing consumers from benefiting from lower prices. Let's take one industry, for example, solar panels. In China, there are lots of solar panel companies. Many of them are being subsidized by the Chinese government. They wouldn't exist. They wouldn't make a profit if it weren't for the Chinese government. That's stupid, in my opinion, to do that. You're robbing resources from Chinese people by doing that. However, you're allowing American consumers to get solar panels at pennies on the dollar. Now, why should I stop that? Why should I stop China from being stupid by imposing a tariff on these goods to prop up jobs stateside? That doesn't make any sense.
But you agree that Trump will win because he raised this trade deal thing, the Rust Belt, it really resonated. I kind of felt, because he was talking the same thing back in the 80s, in the 1980s.
He was.
And also 2010, he came out, he came out a lot on, Greta Van Sustren's On the Record show, and he kept talking about it. And I felt, if he keeps on, ramping this up, he has a good chance, I kind of felt that way. And I know that company CEOs can say that, but as a presidential candidate, he also has a right to say, hey, I'm going to put tariffs and try to protect the American jobs here. Isn't that right? Well,
you said a lot of things, Michael. First of all, he's absolutely right. Politically, people don't like the idea that jobs are, quote, being lost to foreign countries. And from a political standpoint, it was a very appealing message. If you're an out-of-work automaker in Wisconsin or in Pennsylvania or in Michigan, he's playing your song. Excuse me. Whether or not that's good economic policy is a whole different question. So I don't quarrel with his instincts as a politician. It was very good political rhetoric. But in the real world, what real CEOs try and do is make money. And their job is to make money. And you're hurting the company, you're hurting America by stopping people from seeking the lowest possible way of manufacturing, producing, and distributing a good.
So you believe it's just rhetoric? He can't bring back all the jobs that already went to manufacturing?
What he can do, and what I did support, was what he said about the corporate tax rate. It's 35%. It's far higher than any other corporate tax rate in the industrialized world. He's going to lower it to 15. He's also going to do something about these stupid regulations to fight climate change. I believe climate change is a lot of hype. And even if we did everything we could to prevent what we could do to stop man-made carbon dioxide, it won't have any effect in the world because Japan, China, and India are also manufacturing. So it wouldn't do anything at all, even if we did all those things. But what you're doing is hurting jobs, hurting production. And so what Donald Trump wants to do is stop, if not roll back, the $100 billion in brand new regulations that Obama put on the backs of American businesses every year he's been in. So if Donald Trump cuts the corporate tax rate, rolls back some of these regulations, that might give an incentive for CEOs to keep businesses here or to even return businesses. You can do that. But to put a tariff on a good because somebody put a company somewhere else, it's ridiculous. And all you're doing is punishing consumers.
So I don't think he said anything racist, to be honest with you. Donald Trump.
I don't think he did
in my
either.
opinion, and you're a black commentator, so I wanted to know your opinion because the media has been putting this out that he's so
Right.
his comments are so racist, it's bigotry, and
Right.
we pretty much the Korean media pretty much just translate it. They say New York Times said this,
Right.
Washington
So-
Post.
so therefore
And
it must
to
be
them,
true.
it's a Bible.
Right.
We consider like it's the Bible of the media or something like that. So I wanted to know your opinion. Did he say anything racist in your opinion?
No. He said things that were inartfully expressed, maybe. I think the hits are, he said Mexicans were rapists. He wasn't saying all Mexicans. He was talking about some of the illegal aliens who come here. He also referred to a judge who was born in Indiana as a Mexican. And what he meant was the judge was biased in his opinion and would not be fair to him. I shouldn't have said it. But he wasn't maligning the judge, and he wasn't maligning Hispanic Americans. He also allegedly made fun of a handicapped reporter. The reporter used to work for the New York Times, now works for the Washington Post, or it might be the other way around, I can't remember.
I think now he used to work for New York Times.
Okay, now he works for the Post, yeah. And the guy has some sort of physical challenge, but he doesn't go like this. And when Donald Trump went like this, he was mocking that reporter because the reporter had written a story some years before about how many Muslims were cheering on 9/11. Then when Donald Trump said he saw a lot of Muslims cheering, excuse me, and used that reporter to corroborate it, the reporter says, oh, I didn't really write that or I really didn't mean that. So Donald Trump was mocking him because he was retreating from his position. It's the same gesture that Donald Trump has used to mock himself, to mock Ted Cruz, to mock an army general when the general was asked about ISIS, and it's what he does.
Yeah.
So he wasn't mocking him. Furthermore, the reporter doesn't go like this. He's got something wrong with his arm, but he doesn't go like this anyway. So that all of a sudden became the narrative, Donald Trump is making fun of a handicapped person. He was not doing it at all. So, and the other thing I think he said about a black person was that there was some black supporter at a campaign stop, and he referred to him as my African-American supporter.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, Donald Trump has demeaned black people. Really? And Donald Trump also said that inner cities were hellholes or something like that. And that was all of a sudden translated into Donald Trump thinks blacks live in hell. Well, in the inner city, there's a 50% dropout rate. The kids who do graduate from high school cannot read, write, and compute at grade level. A third of young black men have criminal records. 50% or more of black teenagers can't find jobs. What would you call that? It's a problem. It's a huge problem, and all Donald Trump did was address it. And it's interesting, Republicans get hammered for not caring about the black community. Donald Trump tries to do something about it and gets hammered for demeaning the black community. So what do you want?
Did you like him going to the inner cities like Detroit? Was he the first Republican candidate in your, in your memory
No.
to go there to these churches and
First one,
say,
first one to
what
do.
have you got to lose?
First
I'll
one,
do
first
my
one to
best.
do it to the degree that he did. Yes, but other candidates have gone to the inner city, but nobody has made it a campaign point the way he did, and no one has said what do you have to lose, and no one made the kind of pitch for the black vote the way he did. By the way, I was with him when he was in Cleveland at one of the black churches, and he made an appeal that I've never seen a Republican make. And I predicted that he's going to get a lot more black support than a lot of people predicted, and he did. He got more black support than Mitt Romney did, way more than John McCain did. He even got more Hispanic support than Mitt Romney did, even though many people consider him to have demeaned Hispanics, particularly Mexican Americans. And so it's fascinating that all these people said all these horrible things about him, yet he did so much better with people of color than his prior standard bearer, Mitt Romney.
You mentioned about the black community, having a lot of problems. Was it always like this, or why do you think it became, that way?
Well, the primary reason that the black community is suffering, the primary reason that the Hispanic community suffers, is because of the lack of fathers in the home. Between 1890 and 1940, believe it or not, a black child was slightly more likely to be born to a married mother and father than even a white family. But because of welfare and because of the incentives that we've given women to marry the government that allow men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility, we've gone from, in 1965, 25% of black kids born outside of wedlock to 73% right now. And I didn't say it, Obama said it. A kid raised without a father is 5 times more likely to be poor, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. So if you have a community where only 73% where 73% of the kids are born outside of wedlock, you have a community that has increased its odds of having a bunch of dropouts, increased its odds of poverty, increased its odds of black boys and young men going to prison. That is the number one problem. And everything else is a symptom. When you talk about interactions with the cops, the reason the cops are there is because of the high number of young black men, many of them gang-related, who are committing crimes. And crimes against the majority of the law-abiding black people in that very same community.
Abraham Lincoln, he was the one who abolished, slavery,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought that, if you just look at the history, I thought that blacks should be more kind of, pro-Republican. Why did it flip to the Democrats, and it's pretty much staying there?
Right.
All the way up till.
Well, you're right. Lincoln freed the slaves, and blacks voted Republican, of course, for a very long period of time. 2 things changed it. The first thing that changed it was the New Deal of FDR in the 30s. And blacks went from voting almost all Republican to probably about 60%, a little bit more than that, Democrat, because of all these programs. There was one program called the NRA, which is called the National Recovery Act. I have an uncle who lives in Detroit. He grew up on a farm with my mom, and he called it the N-word Recovery Act. And so that's how a lot of people refer to it as, giving people something for the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, there was a 50% unemployment rate for black men. 25% in the country in general, but 1 out of 2 black men had no job. So having these kinds of social programs were perceived to benefit black people disproportionately. So black people then began voting Democrat. That was one big factor. The second big factor happened in the 60s. During the 1960 campaign between Kennedy and Richard Nixon, Martin Luther King was arrested. And his campaign advisors wrote letters to the Nixon campaign and the Kennedy campaign, the same letter, and said, please do something. Nixon was reluctant. Nixon's a lawyer. Nixon felt that it wasn't his job that ethically you can't pick up the phone and interfere with the case going on. Plus, his boss was the incumbent president, Dwight Eisenhower, and it was his boss's job to do something about it. Nixon was trying to get Eisenhower, who was very popular, to be more enthusiastic about supporting Nixon, and so he didn't want to. So he felt trapped to do something. Robert Kennedy, Jack Kennedy's brother, picked up the phone, called the judge, put pressure on the judge. The judge released MLK. And I got to tell you, I was a kid when this happened. I was 8 years old, but I remember it being discussed in church. And all around the country, that weekend, that was the story. And it went from maybe 60% Republican, Democrat, now to about 80% Democrat. And so those 2 major things happened. And the Democrats have been very successful in marketing the myth that they were the party of civil rights, when in fact, first of all, Lincoln freed the slaves. The Democrats were against the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. 13th Amendment freed the slaves.
They
14th,
were actually a very racist.
very racist, voted against them unanimously. Even the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was enacted after Kennedy died, and probably as a result of Kennedy's death, a greater percentage of Republicans supported it than Democrats did. And also the Democrats have peddled this lie that there was this big switch in the South. The racists in the South left the Republican Party and joined the racists in the South left the Democratic Party and joined the Republican Party. Not true. Of the Democrats that voted against the Civil Rights Bill, only one or two of them switched to the Republican Party. Most of them died Democrats. George Wallace, who famously stood in the school door and segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, he died a Democrat. Most of these people died Democrats. The reason the South shifted from Democrat to Republican had to do with lots of things. The Vietnam War, unions, it's more anti-union, they're more pro-life. And so these are the cultural shifts that made people in the South go from being Democrats to being Republicans. And it had very, very little to do with this notion that Republicans wanted to continue being racist, and so we have to leave the Democratic Party. That's crap, but a lot of black people believe that.
So it was a cultural thing too.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still believe?
And ideological.
Do you still believe that America is a center-left country after this election, or what, did it kind of change your opinion?
No, I think America is not a center-right country. It's a center-left country, although many of my colleagues on talk radio think of it as a center-right country. And I'll give you two major issues, abortion and same-sex marriage. Even Donald Trump recently in an interview in 60 Minutes was asked about both abortion and asked about gay marriage. And he said, gay marriage is settled.
Yes, by
Well, so is abortion.
Actually, yeah.
Yeah, but here he wants to put judges on to reverse Roe v. Wade. Well, why don't you want to put judges on to reverse the gay marriage? And the answer is he's okay with gay marriage. And even on abortion, while the majority of Americans believe that abortion is wrong, especially late-term abortion, I think most Americans do not want the government to completely prohibit the practice. And these are shifts to the left on these two very major issues.
Okay, let's talk about Middle East, you know. It is a mess right now.
Huge mess.
It's a huge mess. I don't know whether we can solve it, you know, in my lifetime. I don't know. Who do you think is more responsible, George W. Bush or Barack Obama, President Obama?
For the mess, I think the persons most responsible are the radical Muslims, are the terrorists.
Okay.
You know, the people that took over Iran in 1979. Iran is worse off now. People have less freedom now, and there has been a radical Islam movement for hundreds of years. It's just been dormant in many stages of our historical development. But even the Barbary Pirates. Shortly after America became a country, there were pirates off the coast of northern Africa that were intercepting and boarding American shipping. And we sent a couple of ambassadors to an area which is now known as Libya to find out what the hell was going on. And the ambassadors were told, it's nothing personal, we're Muslims. This is what we do. And in the Quran, it says that if you're an infidel, you have three options. You can convert, you can pay a tax, or you can be killed. And unfortunately, there's 10% of the Muslim population in the world, 1.2 billion people, that feel that way. And some number of that are perfectly okay to strap on bombs or strap on bombs on their children and kill you. And that is a cancer within that religion, in my opinion. And it can only be won by the majority of people in the Islamic religion who don't feel that way, who change the teaching, change madrasas, and change the mentality of clerics. When you have clerics preaching that Jews are pigs and monkeys and that infidels need to be killed, and you have a lot of madrasas doing that around the world, funded often by Saudi Arabia, you got a problem. Do I believe Obama made it worse? I do. I think what George W. Bush tried to do by going into Iraq is, one, making sure that a dictator like Saddam Hussein did not use a WMD on us.
The majority of the people were for it at the time, right?
73% of the American people were behind that war. And then after it went badly, all of a sudden, George W. Bush was called a liar and all these kinds of things. And I think he should have defended himself better. And I think there was a huge mistake.
But wasn't it relatively safe back in 2008 when he was leaving office?
Yes. We had, in my opinion, won that war. And there was a whole infrastructure there where people in Iraq were telling us who the bad guys were because we promised we were going to stay until they could stand up. And so you had people coming forward and ratting out the bad people. Now, Obama pulls out all this infrastructure. All the people that we had trained were now replaced with cronies. That's why the Iraqi army just ran when ISIS came, because they didn't trust their commanding. They didn't trust their leaders because they knew the leaders were hacks. They weren't there because of their being the best and the brightest. They were there because they were replaced by al-Maliki, who put all his buddies there and put him on the payroll. So we just undid everything that our soldiers did during the time that we went in there in 2003. And I think it was a massive, massive mistake. It led to ISIS, to the growth of ISIS. And it also led to a massive refugee problem that infected the entire area.
So why do you think President Obama was so hell-bent on pulling out from Iraq at that time, as in a vacuum?
Obama has the mentality that a lot of Democrats have, and that is that America has always been a force for imposing its will on other nations. And if we minded our own business, they would mind their own business. It's a naive point of view. Also, I think Obama, having grown up in Indonesia and having had a father who was Muslim, kind of felt a little more, had a much more benign attitude towards Islam, even towards radical Islam, than I think other people have. That said, there was no policy that he had that his party objected to. Nobody stood up and said, Mr. Obama, I don't think it's a good idea to pull out of Iraq. They cheered this. Mr. Obama, I don't think it's a good idea for you to join with the French and British in bombing Libya, because Gaddafi has now become somewhat of an ally. Nobody stopped him. And so those policies, the policies that he did with the Iran deal, his policy cheered it. And speaking of the Iran deal, Robert Gates was his Secretary of Defense. And when he left office, he wrote a book. It was one of the most scathing books I've ever seen a former cabinet member write about a sitting president. And he was asked by Bob Schieffer on CBS, why is Obama doing this Iran deal? And Schieffer said, and Gates said that Obama is doing this because of the hope that after 10 years of prosperity, Iran will turn away from exporting terrorism and join the community of nations. A hope that Robert Gates said was unrealistic. So you have your own Secretary of Defense saying that your deal was built on a hope that's unrealistic. And now Iran has a roadmap towards getting a nuclear bomb, and it is the #1 exporter of terrorism in the world. And I think it is a catastrophic mistake.
Do you think Iran deal alone kind of, really derailed his presidency, in your opinion, about President Obama? 'Cause
Well,
a lot of people criticized it, and it just seems like he was. I don't understand the deal.
Well, when you say derail his presidency, he managed to get 2 terms, and so they couldn't throw him out of office after that. But do I think history will judge this thing badly? Depends on what happens. If Iran does something with that bomb, and I believe that Iran has they have the capability of doing it, the only question is the political judgment of doing it. If Iran uses a nuclear bomb and in some sort of major way hurts the world, that's going to be on Obama's resume. And he's a young man, and he'll be around for a long time, and we'll be able to see the fruits of this deal for ill or for good, and I hope I'm wrong.
You wish that there was no deal at all?
There shouldn't have been a deal at all, no. Frankly, I think that years ago we should have taken military action against Iran. And I think if Mitt Romney had been elected president in 2012, we probably would have. But it's too late now. They've distributed their nuclear program. They put it underground. They've hardened it. So if Israel were to attack Iran has a bunch of sleeper cells all over the country, all over the world, ready to send these people into battle. And so Iran is now too prepared. But there was a time when I think, had there been a concerted effort to take them out militarily, we could have done so.
Okay. I want to talk about the race issue. You see, America now being more racially divided. I think, with the Black Lives, Matter and movement and all these protests and riots that has been happening. But we have a black president now, right? And so I thought that it would always, change the dynamic of, I thought that we are, kind of more even. I supported him actually the past 2 elections because
my condolences.
Just because he was a minority, and I thought that it would also have a positive effect on Asian Americans here too. So I wanted to know your thought on that.
Well, I opposed him from the very beginning because he's too left wing. He wanted to raise taxes. He wanted to do Obamacare. He wanted regulations. He was a climate change alarmist. I don't vote for Democrats. I don't vote for Democrats because they raise taxes. They undermine economic prosperity, in my opinion. They are full of grievances, and they convince minorities that they're victims. And I thought Obama would do all of that, and unfortunately, he has done that. But you asked me if race relations are worse. On the surface, they are worse in the sense that a lot of people are disappointed because Obama, they thought we were going to bring the people together. I never thought that. But when I look at race relations, I look at things like, can I, as a black person, get a good education in America? And the answer is hell yeah. If I have the right grades and the right test scores, it's actually easier for a black person or a Hispanic to get into a college or university because they want diversity and they lower the standards because of race-based preferences. They deny it, but they do it. So can I get an education? And education is the route towards the middle class. So the door is wide open. Can I marry somebody if I want to and if she wants to marry me? Interracial marriage is booming in this country, especially here in California. Maybe 1 in every 5 marriage now in California is between people of different ethnic groups or different races. It used to be a rarity in this country. It is booming. And can I live in a neighborhood where I want to live if I can afford to live in that neighborhood? The answer is yes. There are all sorts of reasons for that, but the primary reason is economic. Most people, if you can afford to buy a house, will sell you a house in that neighborhood. So that's what matters. Can I get a house? Can I get a job? Can I meet and marry whom I want to meet and marry? And the answer is yes. Now, when people talk about race relations are getting worse, what they really mean, Michael, is how do blacks and whites feel about each other? Nobody cares about Asians. Nobody cares about Latinos. They just care about how blacks feel about whites. That's all people really mean when they talk about race. And that brings us to Black Lives Matter and the perception that there is this there is this institutional racism, yeah, and it's BS. Last year, according to the Washington Post, 965 people were killed by the police. Of that number, 500 of them were white, 250 were black. I defy you, Michael, to name one white person who was killed by the cops. You probably can't. But we could probably name half a dozen or so of black people who died at the hands of the police, whether it's Michael Brown or Freddie Gray or Eric Gardner, Trayvon Martin, although that wasn't a police officer, because these become cause celebs. But the fact of the matter is, in the last 45 years, there's been a 75% decrease in the number of blacks killed by the police. 75% decrease. There have been 2 studies recently, one by a black economist from Harvard, who found out that the police are more hesitant, more reluctant to use deadly force on a black person than on a white person. And why? Because they know there's going to be a raft of grief. You're going to be accused of racism. The Justice Department is going to come in. The newspapers are going to come in. So if anything, a cop is more wary about shooting and killing a black person than anybody else. So it's just not true. And of the 950 people that were killed by the police last year, less than 4% were a white cop killing an unarmed black person. Most of the black people who were killed were people who were assaulting the police or resisting arrest or had a weapon. So it's rare. 250 black people killed by the police last year, as I mentioned. 400 people in this nation were injured by lightning. I don't know any. I don't know anybody got injured by lightning. So that's rare. It's very, very rare. What's not rare, unfortunately, is a number of black people killing other black people. Of the murders in this country, half of them are black victims. Half of them, even though blacks are just 13% of the population. And of the murder victims, 94% of them are black people doing the killing. And that's primarily going on in the inner city, primarily going on between and by young blacks, many of whom come from homes where there's no father. It's all connected.
So according to that, the media pretty much made the Black Lives Matter.
I think so. I mean, the whole thing started after Ferguson. Hands up, don't shoot turns out to be a lie. He didn't have his hands up. He wasn't saying don't shoot. He was running towards Officer Darren Wilson, not away from him. They found Michael Brown's DNA on the cop's gun. That's how close he was. So the whole thing's a lie. And still you have the Black Lives Matter movement chanting hands up, don't shoot. So the whole thing is a lie. Freddie Gray, the 6 cops that were involved in what people perceived to be his murder. They tried, 3 or 4 of them? All 4 of them, they failed to get a conviction, and so now they're not going to try the other 2. The grand jury in New York failed to return an indictment against the cops that were involved in Eric Gardner's death. Darren Wilson, as we talked about, was found not guilty. Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman was found not guilty in the Trayvon Martin case. Virtually none of these cases has resulted in the police officers either being tried or, if they're tried, being convicted because the officers were doing their job. The fact of the matter is, if Black Lives Matter really cares about black people, they should be in Pico Union talking about these gangs. They should be in South Central talking about the Crips and the Bloods. That's what they should be doing. But you let some white cop kill a black person, oh my God, all hands on deck. But a normal shooting like in Chicago, they're on track, Michael, for 700 homicides. That's way more than last year. And Chicago's a third black, a third white, and a third Hispanic, but 70% of these homicides are black on black. And 70% of them are unsolved. They will never result in anybody being punished for the crime. Where's Black Lives Matter on that? That's just one city.
4,000 died ever since Barack Obama became president, right? In Chicago City.
Something like that, yeah. And tens of thousands have been shot.
I wanted to know your opinion about the LA riot. You know, the Korean community had been really hit hard at that time. I wanted to know your opinion. I think I never heard you mention about that before, so I wanted to know, your opinion about the relationship between, Koreans and blacks now, the whole thing.
Well, the LA riots was an outrage, and it was an assault on the Korean American community, and it was wrong. And a lot of Korean American businesses were targeted for the sin of being successful. And a lot of blacks feel that Korean Americans have come to the inner city and taken their jobs and taken over businesses, when in fact it's just entrepreneurial, hardworking people looking to make money, which I thought was the American way. And so a lot of it is this victim mentality that a lot of blacks have, and I blame politicians and the media for that. And I also blame them for failing to cover it for what it is, which was an assault on the Korean American community. Just as Crown Heights was an assault on the Jewish community. And the New York Times was covering it as if Jews and blacks were both assaulting each other equally, and it's simply not true. There was a New York Times reporter who said his boss was basically telling him to try and find stories where Jews were attacking blacks. He couldn't find any. But the Crown Heights riots is perceived to be this conflict between Jews and blacks, when in fact it was a concerted effort to go after the Jewish community by a small number of black people. And in my opinion, if you look at the LA riots, Korean American store owners were targeted unfairly for the crime of simply being successful.
Okay. Why was it just Koreans at that time? Not, there were other Asians too, but I was wondering why the blacks just specifically
I can't answer that other than to say that there were and still are a lot of Korean-owned businesses in the inner city. And as a result, the perception was that Koreans were rude, that ethnically they're not being gracious when black people come in there, and all these silly kinds of things that people look for. And so the Korean American community had to go through community training to try and be more polite and stuff like that, and it's just ridiculous.
And President Obama said that, I think in his previous speeches he said that America is not a Christian nation. Have you heard about him speaking that? And he would criticize the Bible, like both Old and New Testament, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether you are aware of that.
I don't recall him saying America was not a Christian nation, but America is a Judeo-Christian nation. Of course it is.
All right.
Yeah,
And
the founding fathers were people who believe in God primarily, and they were not atheists, and most of them were God-fearing. And you heard that the famous line that I think it was John Adams who said, "This Constitution is built for a nation that is moral and religious, and it is not suitable for a nation that is neither."
President Obama currently has, I think the most recent one was 56% approval rating. They say this is really high and high.
It's the highest it's ever been, I think.
Is it high compared to the previous presidents?
It's very high for him.
Mm-hmm.
I think JFK, when he was killed, had a 70% popularity rating. Mm-hmm. But for Obama, since the early days of his presidency, it's gone down and down and down. And this is the highest it's been in a long time.
Doesn't it mean that people are kind of liking his policies then? Or what do you thought about that?
I think people make a distinction, Michael, between Obama as a person, Obama as a husband, Obama as a father, and Obama's policies. Obamacare has never been popular. The Iran deal has never been popular. and 70% of the country believes we're on the wrong track economically, and about that same percentage believes we're on the wrong track as far as foreign policy is concerned. Obama's been in charge for 8 years, so they're talking about him. And this election was a referendum on Obama's policies because Hillary ran making no criticism of Obama, nothing. She didn't criticize anything on foreign policy. She made no criticism about his economic policy. She didn't say this was wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. She said Obama does not get enough credit for getting us out of the ditch that we were in when he inherited the economy from George W. Bush. And so what she's really saying is, stay the course. That's why she lost.
This is because of his personal charisma. That's why he's keeping this approval rating, right?
I think so, and I think people have always felt that he's sincere and that he is doing what he believes to be right. And I think people also think that he's conducted himself in a dignified way.
Yes.
And black people especially
Very great speaker.
have felt that way, yeah, articulate.
If you have to grade him, what would you give him from A to F?
F, 49. It's the first recovery that we've ever had where not 1 year has been at least 3% GDP. Ronald Reagan's recovery was 4% GDP. And the difference between a 2% GDP, which is what we've had, and a 3% recovery GDP is 1 million jobs times the number of years of the recovery. So if Obama had done nothing, if he hadn't done Obamacare, if he hadn't done the stimulus, if he hadn't raised taxes, if he hadn't spent all this money fighting climate change, if he hadn't done stupid things like cash for caulkers and cash for clunkers, we would have had 7 million more jobs right now than we have already. But he's done a lot of damage, and that's why we've had this bad recovery. The Iran deal, catastrophic. The unleashing of the EPA on the backs of American businesses, catastrophic. Raising taxes on the middle class, which he promised not to do, catastrophic. Pulling out of Iraq when we had that thing won, catastrophic. There's virtually no decision that this man has made that I've agreed with.
Let's talk about you, Larry. I wanted to know about your life story. It's a very dramatic and emotional, story with you and your father. Can you talk about that?
Well, my father's story is dramatic and emotional. Mine really isn't. I've had a pretty easy life.
Oh.
My father and I didn't get along, but it was because my father was such a grouchy person and ill-tempered, I thought. And he would get mad at the smallest little things and would start screaming at us. I've got 2 brothers. We all felt the same way about him. We were just afraid of him. And I didn't understand why he was so volatile all the time. And my dad was a janitor. He cleaned toilets for a living. And when I was 10 years old, he started a little cafe in the Pico Union area. And I regretted it because I felt that I would have to work for him. I didn't want to be around him. And of course, I did have to work for him for several years. And my dad would often yell at me in the cafe. And it's a small cafe, so everybody could hear it. And it was embarrassing. So I was 15 years old. I wish I could say to you, Michael, that I had enough guts to say, look, Dad, let's have a talk.
I wish I did too.
But I was afraid of him. So I told myself the next time he yells at me, I'm going to walk out. And the waitress had called in sick that day. And the place was full of people. The food is very, very good. My dad was a very good restaurateur. But he yelled at me, so I walked out. Full of people. He was furious. So that day he came home, he asked me why I walked out, and I told him, I got tired of the way you spoke to me. My dad paid me $10 a day plus tips. So he took the $10, he balled it up and threw it at me as I was sitting on my bed. He walked out of my bedroom, and we did not have a conversation for 10 years.
That was 15?
When I was 15 years old.
So 10 years will mean until 25?
Yeah, until 25 years old. I didn't talk to him.
You didn't call him?
Nothing. And when I graduated from high school, I was 17, I moved away to the East Coast to go to college. And then I went to law school in the Midwest. So I was not around him. And when I would come back home on summers and Christmas holidays to visit my parents, I didn't talk to him. Just act like he wasn't in the room. And our house was not big, but big enough so that you could avoid each other. And my dad came home late anyway, and so it was really easy to avoid him. We did not speak for 10 years. So now I'm 25 years old. I'm a lawyer, and I'm working for a big law firm in Cleveland, and I started having difficulty sleeping. And I figured it had something to do with my father. And I decided that I would have a conversation with him. I wrote about this in my last book, Dear Father, Dear Son, 2 Lives, 8 Hours. I'm leaving out some plot points, but this is pretty much the Cliff Notes version. So I called my secretary and I said, cancel all my appointments. I'm going to go to LA. And I didn't tell my parents I was coming. I got a cab from LAX to my dad's restaurant. I walked in at 1:30. The restaurant closed at 2:30. I walked in with 2 big suitcases. My dad was surprised to see me. And he said, should you put your cases in the back? I said, no, I'm only going to be here for 10 minutes. He said, okay, well, wait until the restaurant closes and we'll talk. So I sat there for an hour, and I was trying to decide, what am I going to say to this SOB? What am I going to say to him? And I said, Larry, be calm. Don't go off on him. Just tell him how you felt about the whippings, and when he used to hit you with a telephone cord sometimes and get his belt and hit you, and how mean you thought he was and how ill-tempered you thought he was. Just kind of be calm. So I waited for a whole hour trying to think of what I was going to say. My dad came around and sat next to me in a little stool, and I went off on him. I told him all the things he ever said to me that bothered me.
You remembered everything.
I remembered everything. I told him what he said and why he said it, why I thought he said it, and how mean I thought he was. And I talked for 20 minutes nonstop. And finally I was out of ammunition. And my dad said, is that it? And I said, yeah. He said, you didn't speak to me for 10 years because of that? And I said, yeah. And my dad said, let me tell you about my life. I knew nothing about my father other than I knew he was an only child. And I had met his mother, my grandmother, one time before. Outside of that, I never met any relatives of my dad, any friends of my dad. And my dad started telling me about his life. And for the first time, Michael, I saw my dad cry. And my dad told me about the man who raised him, for the most part. His name was Elder. And Elder was not his biological father. Elder never married his mother. My father never met his biological father. He's telling me all this as I'm sitting there. And his mother was illiterate, couldn't read or write. My dad was born in the back of a room somewhere. He doesn't even know his birth date because his mother couldn't write it down. She never worked, had a series of boyfriends, one more irresponsible than the other one. Elder just stayed in his life the longest. He was an alcoholic who was physically abusive to him, physically abusive to his mom. He was a drunk, and when he would come home from work, when he did work, he would give my dad's mother the paycheck so he wouldn't spend the money. And then come Wednesday, he'd want the money. She wouldn't give it to him. He'd beat the crap out of her, beat the crap out of him if he interfered. And this went on over and over and over again. He left my dad's life. My dad is now 13 years old, and he comes home, and he gets into a verbal confrontation with his mom's then boyfriend. The mom sides with the boyfriend, throws my father out of the house, never to return.
He's just 13.
13 years old, Jim Crow South, at the beginning of the Great Depression, a black boy in Athens, Georgia. And he just went around trying to get any kind of work he could get and a series of different jobs. And ultimately he became a Pullman porter on the trains, which is why he ultimately came out to California on a run one time and saw how sunny it was and people seemed more friendly. And my dad made a mental note that maybe someday, if I ever relocate, I'll relocate to LA. World War II breaks out, Pearl Harbor. My dad joins the Marines and becomes a staff sergeant in the Marines in charge of cooking facilities. When the war is over, he goes back to the South to get him a job as a cook, and he's told, we don't hire niggers. He goes different restaurant to restaurant to restaurant, and he's told this. He goes to an unemployment office. Now, he's telling me all this as I'm sitting here. With two stools, this close, we're talking. And the conversation lasted 8 hours. And he would tell me what happened to his life. And my dad got bigger and bigger and bigger, and I got smaller and smaller and smaller. And finally, at the end of 8 hours, I'm listening to this man's life. And he was married before, which I didn't even know, twice. The first time, the parents of the girl he married walked them down to court to annul the marriage because they thought my dad, because he dropped out of school when he was in the 8th grade, was not good enough. The second marriage was a woman who cheated on him. And all this, he's telling me all of this. And he always wanted to have children. And the reason that my dad was grouchy was because he worked 2 full-time jobs as a janitor. He cooked for a company called Nabisco, and then got a job with another bread company called Barbary Bread, cleaning toilets. He cooked for a family on the weekend, and he went to night school to get his GED. My dad probably averaged about 3.5 to 4 hours of sleep every night, if that.
Lack of sleep.
Yeah. And if I go 3 or 4 days with only 4 or 5 hours, you don't want to be around me. And so imagine coming home with 3 rambunctious boys making noise and yelling and screaming, and you're tired, and you've been working this hard. Of course you're going to explode, and my dad did. And so after this conversation, I apologized to him. And my dad said, you have nothing to apologize to me for. You just didn't know. And my dad and I became very good friends for the next 35 years. And so I wrote this book about him. It's called Dear Father, Dear Son, because after we had this long conversation, I went back to Cleveland, my dad wrote me a letter. He'd never written me a letter before. And the letter started out, Dear Son, and just talked about our conversation. I wrote him back, and my letter said, Dear Father, which I never called him father. I always called him Dad. And so the book is called Dear Father, Dear Son, 2 Lives, 8 Hours, about the 8-hour conversation that we had.
That's just an amazing story. And he passed away?
Yeah, he passed away about 5 years ago. He was almost 96 years old, we think. The reason, he knows what year he was born, he doesn't know what date. And when he enrolled in kindergarten, the teacher asked him what his birth date was. And my dad said, I don't know. So she wrote down hers, May 25. And so that's when we celebrated.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think my bosses wanted to ask you some questions, just a couple questions about the homeless issue right now. What is how do you think we can fix this? You know?
It's an intractable problem, homelessness. They're always going to be with us. If you live in a society that is a civil society with civil rights, most people who are homeless are people that have mental problems or they're drug addicts. Unless you are of danger to yourself or danger to others, you cannot physically grab somebody and put them in some sort of mental institution. You can't do that. What you can do is have homeless shelters and raise money for people to voluntarily go into them, but that's about all you can do. What you ought not do is to encourage it, which is what they've done in the Bay Area, by essentially rewarding people who are homeless and giving them free money without any kind of requirement to work for it. And so as a result, you have people flocking to places like that. In LA, we're doing the same thing. We are kind of subsidizing homelessness. And if you subsidize it, you're going to get more of it. So I think the only way to deal with homelessness is to have people contribute money for shelters and to send people out to encourage people to go to these shelters and to get medical care and mental counseling. Beyond that, there's not a whole lot you can do.
And you're against the minimum wage, right?
Adamantly against it. 100%
I think
against
it
it.
hurts the black community.
It hurts everybody. It hurts unskilled workers most, because the minimum wage was never designed for people to be able to have a lifestyle on. It's not supposed to. It's supposed to be an entry-level job for people that are secondary earners in their homes, not primary earners in their homes. I was on the Bill O'Reilly show once. I was talking about my second book, where I have a chapter in there about the damage being done on minimum wage. And he said, what is a father with a family of 4 going to do on minimum wage? I said, what is a man with a family of 4? What is a man with minimum wage level skills doing having a family of 4? And he looked like he was hitting the head with a 2x4. You subsidize bad behavior, you're going to get more of it. Again, I told you my dad was a janitor. My dad never went out on the street and picketed to have minimum wage raised. My dad tried to improve his skills, which is why he went to school at night to get his GED and why he took restaurant training to learn how to run a restaurant. My dad believed in investing in himself, making himself more valuable to the market. You make yourself more valuable to the market, your wages will go up.
About the development issue, there's a lot of buildings coming out, especially in Koreatown, all these buildings coming out, and some people are criticizing that this is, gentrification. The people who can't afford it here, they're moving to different areas. So what is your thought on that?
That's life. Sorry. Areas change. Don't you like the idea that you're able to sell your home for a fair market price and make a profit on it? You can't change that, and you shouldn't change it. Just because a neighborhood changes its character, you don't have a right to have that neighborhood maintain its same character.
Were you always good at academics?
I was.
I mean, you were always a straight-A student?
Yes.
And you went to one of the Ivy League schools?
I went to Brown. And then I went to University of Michigan for law school.
Okay, so it was easy for you to be good at academics?
It was easier for me academically when I was in high school, but not when I got into college or law school, and the competition got more severe. Right. No, it wasn't then.
Any last words for our viewers and readers you want to say?
No, other than America, to me, is the greatest country in history. It is a country where you can go from nothing to something faster than anywhere else in all of human history, and life is a series of choices. You make a bunch of bad choices, and bad things are going to happen. And no matter how awful your life is, you have an obligation, a duty, to pick those cards up and play them to the best of your ability. And if you do that, people will help you. People will come. People want people to realize their potential. It doesn't help anybody to have a group of people, whether it's blacks or browns, believing that they're victims, so they underperform, so they don't contribute to the tax base. So most people want people to realize their potential. People are not out to get you. There's no conspiracy. There's no boogeyman. It's all up to you. Look in the mirror. My dad used to tell me this: hard work wins. You get out of life what you put into it. You can't control the outcome, but you are 100% in control of the effort. And before you complain about what somebody did to you, go to the nearest mirror and ask yourself, could I have changed the outcome? And no matter how hard you work, how good you are, bad things will happen. How you respond to those bad things will tell people whether or not you are a responsible adult. And those are the lessons my dad taught my brothers and me, and that's what I think the country needs to get back to.
Thank you very much, Larry, for stopping by Korea.
My pleasure. Thank you.